Welcome back to the Brave Writer podcast. I'm Julie Bogart. I'm the founder of Brave Writer, mother of 5 adult kids who were homeschooled, and today a grandmother to 4 with a 5th on the way. Melissa Wiley, my co-host, is off today, so it's just you and me. I thought we would use today's episode to talk about the history of homeschooling, a little bit about how we got to where we are today, and maybe even the role of Brave Writer in that journey. So buckle up, Buttercup. This is going to be an interesting ride. Let's get started. So before we get into homeschooling, let me give you a quick biographical background of me. I was born in the 1960s and went to school in the 70s especially. During that time, I lived in California, and my junior high was actually located in Malibu Canyon. Teachers were newly liberated to try all kinds of new methods of teaching. In fact, one of those methods was called New Math, and we started with Venn diagrams, and that became quite a controversial approach in later years. But here's what I remember from the 1970s. My teachers were often brand new to the teaching experience. They did not have the burden of preparing us for standardized state testing, and so they experimented. I had a science teacher who took our entire class to a creek every day for weeks, where we used field guides to identify bugs and flora and fauna, where we would simply sit and draw and make labels and create a map, a topographical map of the location we were sitting in. I had a history or social studies teacher have us make Aztec pots, paint them, fire them, smash them, and then she buried them and had us go on an archaeological dig for our own work. The entire 7th grade spent weeks preparing for our own Renaissance fair, and then we dedicated an entire school day to hosting a fair on campus with all the students. These are the kinds of memorable experiences I had when I was growing up in California in the 70s. In other words, it was quite a time of reevaluation. How are we going to teach in a way that engages students and breaks free from the rote methods of the 1950s and 60s? Interestingly, simultaneous to my public education, homeschooling was just getting started. A lot of people credit the movement to John Holt and Raymond Moore, who started critiquing the idea that school education could achieve the goals of a truly well-rounded liberal arts education in children. And one of the ways that they challenged that assumption around education in a public school is they wrote books, they gave talks, and they formed a coalition of parents who were curious and interested in keeping their kids home and giving them this freer experience of learning. In 1972, there was a lawsuit of Wisconsin versus Yoder, where an Amish family was claiming they had the right to raise their children outside the public schools in order for them to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. So this was an early ruling that legitimized the right to homeschool based on a religious reason. Without getting into the weeds of all the various court cases, it's good to remember that every single state had to make a decision about homeschooling. We do not have a federal decision that enshrines the right to homeschool in all 50 states. Each state has had to wage a case that has given that right to parents, and as a result, each state has a different set of criteria that guarantee that right. So in some states like Kentucky and Texas, you don't even have to notify your local school district that you're keeping your children home, let alone do tests at the end of the year to validate that your education is achieving goals that the state approves. In other states, some require that you file as a private school. That happens in California, or that you sign up with a charter school so that you have some supervision. There was a time when Pennsylvania required you to keep records of 180 hours of instruction in every single subject for each of your children. That was a wildly heavy burden for homeschooling parents. The thing to remember is this: homeschooling started with this interest in separating from the traditional model of learning that schools had perfected by the 1960s. There was this growing sense that learning could be more experiential, that children could be more invested. John Holt famously said that it was important to recognize that children learn without prods and punishments. This is a really important part of the story of homeschooling to remember, that originally it wasn't just take your kids out of school because you are afraid that they're in school or you don't like the schools. It was to experiment with and explore other ways of learning and teaching. But the rights really did not get well established until religion came into the discussion. And that is because in the United States, we already have freedom of religion as an enshrined right. So if a parent could say that public school, which no longer had prayer in schools or the teaching of the Bible or any attachment to Christianity, if parents could say, well, that violates my freedom of religion to instruct my children the way that I want to, that gave the whole movement ground to stand on. And even secular parents could claim that. I want to teach my children according to my values and my lights. So today, homeschooling is legal in all 50 states. Our reasons for homeschooling, however, vary family to family, but we can see some overarching trends. I was interested to see that the National Home Education Survey took a look at motivations between 2003 and 2007, and those who reported homeschooling to provide religious or moral instruction increased from 72% to 83%. This really struck me. During those years, there was a flourishing of state-run homeschooling organizations, but the vast majority of them were Christian. So if you went to your state homeschool convention, it was a Christian homeschool convention. They didn't bar people who weren't Christians, but when you came to those conferences, you were going to hear religious conversation and leadership and talks. And this created kind of a rift between those who were trying to carve out space based on John Holt or John Taylor Gatto's teachings, and those who were trying to build curricula that would support the religious instruction of their children in addition to things like math, reading, and science. Today, there are like 3.2 million homeschooling families. We saw a huge influx of new homeschoolers post-COVID, because a lot of parents, once they experienced homeschooling in sort of a risk-free year, ended up loving it and sticking with it. And for some of those families, they came into a movement completely green, not knowing the history at all. So I want to share a little bit of my journey. This is more my personal story against that backdrop. And I want to share it in a way that will help you kind of understand why homeschooling is sort of in a moment of both controversy. You know, I read somewhere that 20% of public elementary schools in Arizona were shuttering because of the voucher program, which means that funds that would have gone to those schools are being diverted to parents who want to put their kids in private school or homeschool. And we can debate whether or not you agree with that decision, but homeschooling, for the first time, is having a seismic impact on the vision of education that is the United States of America's responsibility to provide. There are people who would like public education to be completely eliminated, which, in my view, is a big mistake. We need to provide education for the public. Not every parent wants to homeschool or can homeschool. On the flip side, having the right to provide an education that you choose for your children really speaks to the core values of most Americans. So let's take a break, listen to this little ad, and then we will come right back. You know, when I wrote Help, My Kid Hates Writing, I wondered if people who were familiar with my work would feel like it was too familiar, that perhaps it wouldn't have the same impact as it would for people who didn't know anything about Brave Writer. But what I found out by reading the reviews is that even Brave Writer fans, even parents with kids who love writing, found new strategies and ideas within my book to help them be successful writing coaches. Here are some of the feedback that I've received, some of the reviews that I wanted to share with you. One reviewer said, "Another gem of a book by Julie. She always feels like an ally, not only for the home educators, but for the kiddos. This book has solid strategies to help soften the writing experience for kids with the guidance of parents who themselves may need a mental makeover in what writing even is or can be." Another reviewer said to me, "I can't say enough about how wonderful this book is. It's well written, which is good for this type of book, but it's also so useful. It makes it fun to write." And then maybe my favorite review said this book was heartfelt, insightful, actionable, and exactly what we needed. Julie challenges you to think in new ways and encourages you to be the guide your child needs on their language arts journey. Honestly, that was the motivation to write this book. I want you to feel that you can give your children the soft landing pad they deserve as they flex their wings of self-expression. I show you how, I give you great tips and strategies and lots of narrative examples. Check out my new book, Help My Kid Hates Writing. Go to juliebogartwriter.com or any place books are sold. So let me take you back in time to 1984, a little hillside in Spain called Monte Olivos. There were olive trees all around me. It was a beautiful, warm summer afternoon in August. I was sitting on a bench. There was a group of people that I was there with. These were missionaries in North Africa, and I was there to consider whether I wanted to join them. The man that I was dating was also there. He had served in the Peace Corps in Morocco before I met him. We were not engaged. We had only been dating for a few months. The next thing you know, a man approached me. I knew him to be a good friend of John's. He introduced himself, and I said hello, and he sat down on a bench next to me and made the most surprising comment I have ever heard as an introductory remark to a new relationship. "Hi, Julie. Are you going to homeschool your kids?" Okay, as a not even married person, not even engaged person with no children, that felt like a very random question. But worse, I had never heard the words home and school used together. And I looked at him quizzically and said, "Home what?" And he said back, "Home school." I said, "I don't know what that is." And he began to describe for me the reason that he and his wife were homeschooling their 3 children. Now, you have to understand, this was the mid-1980s. Ronald Reagan was president, and this friend went into a long sort of diatribe about the U.S. government and the potential communist takeover, okay? So that was one of his first reasons for homeschooling. But then he pivoted, and he started to describe tailor-made education. How each of his kids weren't even a specific grade level. One was like in 3rd grade math and 2nd grade reading and 4th grade science. You know, there was this feeling that the education his kids were getting was specialized and personalized. And just hearing those words harkened back to my 1970s public school education when I was growing up. I thought, that is what I want for my kids. In fact, when I was in college, a little detour, I worked as an assistant teacher my senior year of college. I was in a Brentwood junior high that had busing. Busing is when they used to bring kids from the inner city into the suburbs and vice versa to help promote racial diversity in schools. And when I worked in this school, what stood out to me the most were the methods of education. So many worksheets, so much testing, so much sitting still in a classroom. Gone were the days of walking down to the creek and drawing a map. It was this sort of systematic education. And when I would go in the lunchroom, the kids were sitting at separate tables. There was no integration. It was a very unhappy environment for learning. So when John's friend began talking about this tailor-made education for children that you could do in another country, I was all in. I found myself signing on his imaginary dotted line. And suddenly John's friend yelled across the courtyard to John, "Hey, she's all right." And John just sort of looked back at him vaguely like, "What do you mean?" A couple days later, John and I got engaged. And wouldn't you know, I started reading about homeschooling right then. One of the joys of those early years in the 80s was that I got to witness families who were providing a home education to their children. And let me tell you, it seemed magical. I would say that my early understanding of what homeschooling could be was formed by watching these beautiful families in the 1980s show me what it could look like to really pay attention to the academic needs of your children while providing them with a rich, experience-drenched life. And that's how I got started. By the time I actually began officially homeschooling, when Noah was, kindergarten aged, we were back in the United States. And lucky for me, my very good friend Dottie and her family moved also from Morocco at the same time and chose to live on our street. So we had our own little built-in community right from the get-go. In California in the 90s, you had to either file as a private school to be considered a legitimate homeschooler, or you had to sign up under an independent study program, what they called an ISP. Today, those would be like their charter school programs in California. So I did that. I signed up for this ISP partly because there were free resources we could check out. Back then, there was no money attached to it. So it was merely meeting in this one building where they occasionally offered some cool classes, some trainings for parents, and the opportunity to check out materials. A good example of that is my son Jacob, when he learned to read, he got to use Pleasant T. Rowland's literacy program. If you don't recognize that name, let me clue you in. She is the founder of American Girl. She is the one who wrote all the books, created the dolls. She had a huge, strong interest in reading and literacy, which is what led her to start that company. And her $1,000 reading program was available for me to check out from this independent study program, and it was fantastic. Jacob basically taught himself to read while I was being pregnant. I was busy working with everyone else, but it was a fantastic program, and I never got to use it again. In the 1990s, homeschooling did not have the advantage of the internet. So most of our homeschooling experience was drawn from local friends. And because churches are a natural infrastructure and networking tool, a lot of homeschoolers formed groups through their churches. It was harder for secular homeschoolers to find each other, and that is one of the sort of flaws of the movement. It was easier for this established community to grow within the infrastructure of church networks. One of the lucky things for me is that I lived on this street in Orange County with my good friend Dottie, and we sort of brought in a couple other families to our street and formed our own community. The primary agenda of homeschooling for us in those days was immersive, experiential, kinesthetic, making learning come alive. And I've shared a lot about that in my book, The Brave Learner, how I made that journey. But what I wanted to share today as we're looking at the history of homeschooling is to think about what happened in terms of curriculum, organization, and the level of conferences that grew in those years. Because the infrastructure for Christian homeschooling was so strong, and it was aided by radio shows like Dr. James Dobson's Focus on the Family, you could see the people in the homeschooling movement gaining confidence. And one of those threads was that these Christian homeschoolers were going to sort of rewrite the way education was communicated. There would be a religious component. There was a lot of criticism of the public schools for removing God from the language of education in the 1960s. There was a desire to bring back, the Ten Commandments in courthouses, prayer in the schools. They started movements like pray at the flagpole or meet at the flagpole, and it would be like a day of prayer just for students. All of these things were happening simultaneous to and through the homeschooling movement. Interestingly enough, I didn't connect with that side of homeschooling personally. It wasn't that I wasn't a churchgoer. I certainly was in the 90s. And in fact, when we moved to Cincinnati, my husband moved here because we were working for a church. So I want to be clear. It wasn't that I didn't attend church or don't know anything about church. I know it intimately. But what happened when I moved from California to Ohio was startling. I remember getting to Ohio and going to that first conference, and one of the speakers, who had 13 children, stood on the stage and literally told us that all children's fiction was dangerous because it had children who didn't obey their parents or children who lied or made bad decisions. And so thankfully, he had written a book series where children honored their parents, and the only scrapes they got in were basically man against nature instead of man against man, right? If you remember back when you were in school and they were trying to define the source of conflict in a novel, this speaker did not believe in the sort of human against self, human against human. It was human against nature, and that was it. And so what you wound up with were these sort of propaganda-oriented novels, not well written, as the only endorsed literature for homeschoolers. And I remember turning to my two friends who brought me to this conference, and I said, wait, is this guy for real? Like, I knew that homeschooling brought out the conservatives in California, but this is like a whole other level. And I had to start to understand that there was a different perspective being cultivated in many of these homeschool groups, and every state had a different flavor. But one of the unifying themes that I saw happening in the writing of curricula, in the speakers at conferences, in the radio shows that talked about homeschooling, was this idea that what was missing in America was leadership that would bring the religious perspective into government. There was a book written by Francis Schaeffer back in the late 1970s called A Christian Manifesto. And he wrote this book as a counter to the Communist Manifesto, right? And I read it back in 1979, maybe 1980, probably 1980. And here was the basic structure of the book. It was the belief that if a government would align itself with Christian principles, everybody's welfare would improve. That's the thesis of the book, that even if people didn't think they wanted that, once they had it, they would be glad because it would be aligned with the purposes of God. Christian homeschooling had this kind of perspective. Certainly, each group is a little different, each co-op is a little different, but there was this overarching sense that Christian homeschooled students were going to be a part of transforming America into a better place. And one of the ways they did that is they started these worldview camps and classes, and parents would send their students for the purpose of being able to deconstruct and examine the worldview of popular culture or secular culture. Now, they use language like critical thinking, and one of my favorite things about homeschoolers, to be honest, is because they have constantly been told that they are pitting themselves against mainstream culture, they do have critical thinking tools. And a lot of times, it's those very tools that make them reconsider their entire childhoods. It's fascinating to me when I talk with them now. But a lot of those classes were more designed to give tools to students to be able to defend their particular beliefs and to do it in the environment of political goals. And so today we see the fruit of some of that. And I wouldn't lay it all at the feet of homeschooling, but I just wanted to kind of point out that there is a continuity here. This has been something that has been on the minds of Christian homeschoolers for a really long time. Today's homeschooling environment, however, has expanded to include secular homeschoolers, which is a community that is growing. It's still nowhere close to the size and scale of Christian homeschooling. But because of charter schools, because of COVID, where a lot of parents left the school system, not for religious reasons, but purely for academic ones, we have this growing community of secular homeschooling. We also see the rise of homeschooling in other religious communities. The Muslim homeschooling population is really big. There are Jewish homeschoolers. We see this change happening. Homeschooling, in a weird way, is becoming mainstream. And I think that's really good news. We actually thrive when we have a cross-section of perspectives, because isn't that what education really is all about? Sometimes parents come to me and they say, I just want community so badly. And what I really hope will happen is that we will put the education as the central component of our connection rather than an ideology, a political affiliation, or a religious worldview. I'm not saying that you cannot have communities that are based on some of your beliefs. Those are really important communities, but I would love to see homeschooling embrace a wider variety of people in their educational spaces, because that allows your children to develop relationships with a wide variety of people. And that's part of the learning journey, isn't it? Not just only knowing people who are just like your family. Brave Writer exists to support homeschoolers from all kinds of backgrounds. We never say that we are faith-centered or secular. I've deliberately used the language of non-sectarian, meaning not aligned with any sect, and that is deliberate. When we teach our classes online, you get to come in through the door of who you are, not through our door, sign a statement, and then perform for us. And that is how we run Brave Writer. Sometimes I get personally accused of being a kind of person that someone else doesn't like. They wish that I held their same beliefs. In fact, ironically, the most frequent challenge I get is that I am not a critical thinker. And what the person means by that is, since you don't align with the perspective I've adopted, you must not have critically thought about this topic. But I can tell you this, just like you, I'm on a journey. I'm constantly revising my beliefs. I stay curious and open to a wide variety of information, and that is the way we build Brave Writer. We are constantly responding to what you tell us, and we are spending time in the research to create the best writing and language arts program that's out there. You are all welcome. So we will pick up this topic again next week. As a matter of fact, I will be interviewing someone who is a home education leader in Canada, and I was provoked by something she said in a social media post about the changing definition of homeschooling, and that's what we're going to discuss next week. So I hope you'll tune in. Please write to me. You can reach me in direct message on Instagram, or you can reach out to us at help@bravewriter.com and let me know what you think. It would be fantastic to have you rate and review this podcast. That supports us really well. And in the meantime, I hope you'll take a look at our Brave Writer class and product offerings to support you in an immersive, kinesthetic approach to writing and reading. Thanks for tuning in today, and I look forward to talking with you next time on the Brave Writer podcast. Okay, that's another Brave Writer episode in the books. Thanks for joining Melissa and me today. We love it when you leave us reviews, when you send us comments via text message. We read them all. We also couldn't do this show without our fabulous production team at Nova, or Jeanette Hall, the Brave Writer team member who handles all those administrative details you know nothing about. In the meantime, We hope that you have a fantastic week. Keep going. Think well. We're rooting for you.